This is the story of a car. A car that was so far out there that it was even weird by 1960 standards, which is saying something. Called Fantasia, it's likely the most insane 1940 Willys in drag racing history, and there have been a lot of them. More than just a car, this is the story of a couple of guys who wanted to go racing their own way and did. It's the story of their struggles to tame an untamable beast and do it with methodology that no one in the sport had ever considered, let alone tried. It's also the story of redemption that, unlike so many others in racing, concludes with a relatively happy ending. The vast majority of the information in this video comes from two magazine features, one in the April 1966 issue of Popular Hot Rodding magazine, and the other in the April 1967 issue of Drag Racing magazine. You'll know more about why these two sources are basically it when it comes to learning about the Willys known as Fantasia. The story begins with Bill Henderson of Paramount, California. A hot rodder, a drag racer, and the owner of Day and Night Towing, he got hung up on the idea of building a really fast, full-bodied car. And of course, you're thinking he decided to build a gasser because if you know anything about drag racing in the 60s, when you see a Willys, you're looking at a gasser. Stone Woods and Cook, K.S. Pittman, Big John Mazmanian, the list goes on forever. In almost every case, in fact, in literally every other case, you'd be right, but Henderson had no interest in gasoline. He wanted to go racing on nitromethane. Fantasia was not a gasser. It was a AA fuel altered. This car was center steer, the engine was moved back 25% in the frame, and it ran on at least 90% nitromethane on every run it ever made. Yes, this big car with its steel from the cowl back, minus the doors, body, was competing against cars like the Winged Express, Pure Hell, Pure Heaven, and the other small fuel alters of the time. Those little bantam-bodied cars and 23 Ford T-body machines underweighed Fantasia by more than 500 pounds. But back to the story. Henderson finds a forlorn 1940 Willys project in the back of someone's barn and buys it for pennies on the dollar. He and pal Dave Griffiths pull it all apart and decide to use the stock Willys frame without tweaking on the wheelbase. This is where the story of Fantasia really gets good, because Henderson shows us not only his creativity, but perhaps a wanton hatred of physics as well. Henderson became kind of obsessed with getting the car as low to the ground as possible for aerodynamic purposes, so he had a custom drop axle made, and as you can see in these photos, the car was literally scraping the earth. Not only did he have the extreme drop axle, the way it was mounted to the car was bordering on the insane as well. Picture this, the axle was mounted to the chassis with a pair of quarter elliptical springs that were on hinges. This allowed incredible 10 inches of front downward travel of said axle. Or better yet, it allowed 10 inches of upward travel of the Willys' nose before the axle was pulled off the ground. Lastly, a completely nuts 35 degrees of caster was dialed into the front end. This was common on dragsters with their long wheelbases of this period, but 100% bizarre and frankly wrong when it came to short wheelbase cars. And the engine? The engine was plucked straight out of the top fuel dragster of Chet Herbert, a 392 Chrysler Hemi from a Chrysler Imperial car that had been bored 20 over, now measured 400 cubic inches, and was the weapon of choice in Fantasia. It had cylinder heads touched up by the famed Jocko Johnson, it had a 671 supercharger on it, and the engine was filled with the best parts money could buy, and it had run over 207 miles an hour in Herbert's dragster before being relocated into the Willys. Horsepower, likely around 1,500 or so, and the blower was making about 20 pounds of boost. How about the transmission? Well, there wasn't one. The car was built with direct drive made by the people at a place called Henry's Machine Works. The high gear only setup was linked to the engine via a custom-built Hayes clutch that took so much leg pressure, the driver, a guy named John Tinkerbell, yes, Tinkerbell Lee, could barely actuate it. The rear axle was hard-mounted to the chassis with no rear suspension. The best decision Henderson made with this car, and in 1966 the list was really short, was hiring the legendary Larry Watson to paint it. He allowed Watson to do whatever he wanted, and the resulting gold paint and flame job came out terrifically, as did so much of Watson's prolific work on race cars and hot rods over the years. So the car was built, it was painted, and it's ready for action. The results in 1966? Absolutely abysmal. The car was beloved by fans as it was a hulking beast as compared to the other AA fuel-altered competition, but it was 100% uncontrollable, did all kinds of weird things when it actually did find traction, and basically tried to wreck itself on every run. To quote the end of the 1966 feature in Popular Hot Rodding, Bill's car was constructed to facilitate new drag ideas. His current success on the strip speaks well for the newcomer. Only future competition will tell the story. That is a pretty damn kind look at what this car was in 1966. But 1967 would be better, right? Not to start with. For 1967, Henderson and now Chief Wrench Warren Robins attacked their problems with verve, and they came up with, and well created, even more mind-boggling solutions to fix their troubles. They made some changes to the front end to try to help the near-suicidal handling of the car, adding radius rods to help control front axle movement. They went back to the strip to try it out. They were afraid what might happen if the axle were allowed to droop, so they installed C-clamps, clamped the axle to the frame, and made runs. Without any droop at all, the car was actually starting to come around, and then one week they decided to take the clamps off. The car would typically smoke the tires all the way down the racetrack, but this time, with the front suspension freed up, the car got traction at about 300 feet. When that happened, the nose popped 10 inches skyward, leading the driver to believe that he was in a huge wheel stand. Lee was convinced the car was heading for the sky, and he lifted. Well, it wasn't. After this situation happened, Henderson came up with an idea. Actually, a pair of ideas, and they were the two most gloriously bizarre solutions to a problem anybody in drag racing has ever come up with. Robinson and Henderson installed air shocks from an airplane that were hooked to an air bottle in the car. The plan was that Lee would open a valve at the launch, shooting the nose of the car up, pressurizing the shocks, and instantly putting maximum weight transfer on the rear wheels. Then, as he went down the racetrack, he would close the valve, allowing the nose to drop so he could see in front of him and have maximum control of the car, as well as getting the nose out of the air and being more aerodynamic. But that wasn't all the guys decided to do. At the same time they installed the aircraft shocks, they built a fully floating subframe for the engine inside the Willys chassis. This allowed the engine itself to raise 3 inches under power. That subframe was hinged on the back of the rear axle. When taking into account the 10 inches of front end travel and now the 3 inches of engine travel, there are now 13 inches of movement in the front end of the race car, something that no car before, during, or since this one was built has ever had, and for obvious reasons, which we'll learn about very shortly. The other major problem came when building the subframe and trying to figure out how to hook up the clutch. Mechanical linkages were out of the question because the geometry of the car changed completely when it went down the racetrack and would cause binding and other problems of systems that needed to be geometrically correct. The solution? The men devised a hydraulic setup using master cylinders from Ford and Chevrolet trucks to actually actuate it. And if you think I'm making any of this up, listen to this quote from 1967's Drag Racing magazine. "In leaps the mysterious air front end. Bill and Warren installed aircraft air shocks in the front, ran lines to a 1,200 cubic inch air bottle connected to the rear. By boosting air pressure, instant lift could be induced at any moment during the run's progress. Give it air, the front end drives up. Wheels stay down. However, you can't go hauling into the 8th mile with your driver unable to see and the car looking like it's trying to climb a pole, so arrangements were made to bleed the air off mid-range and be down on the front end at the end of the drag strip. Really a unique piece of engineering. The Insta-raise thrilled spectators but caused the car literally to go crazy off the line. 2 months later, the idea was abandoned. Concurrent with the fabrication of a new front end came the piecing together of an engine subframe. The engine sat in this subframe, and the subframe was mounted solidly to the rear end. Neatly hinged at the top of the rear end was a separate body frame. Under power, a scissors action applied. The Fantasia's engine performed wheel stands off the body rails. Through tests on commercial scales, their shop proved to Bill and Warren that raising the engine from the body rails by a scant quarter inch resulted in an unbelievable weight transfer of 80%. With their free-floating engine, rigid or mechanical connections couldn't be used for the clutch. An all-hydraulic system was substituted made up of Chevrolet and Ford truck master cylinders and hydraulic lines. 2 cylinders were necessary, one to serve as the master, another to be the slave cylinder at the clutch. A grand total of 13 inches of lift could be achieved between the combination of the main frame rails, coming up 10 inches, and the engine another 3 inches. As it took place, viewers could easily see this weight transferred from front to back and were amazed. Of course, all the workings were hidden until somebody removed the front end. Veterans like Don Garlitz peered inside and then went away, shaking their head. And as if that wasn't enough, the steering then failed because of all this movement. Good thing it failed at about 140 miles an hour and left Lee hanging onto the wheel that was attached to thin air. Quick thinking allowed Lee to get the parachutes out and prevent a horrible crash at Lions Drag Strip. They tried to sort out the front end, but nothing worked. Then, of course, they blamed the driver. 4 other drivers tried to handle this car before Tinkerbell Lee was invited back when they knew he wasn't the problem. The next thing they tried? Adding 400 pounds of ballast to the trunk. Yeah, that didn't help either. Once again, to quote from the Drag Racing magazine article, it gives you an idea of just what people thought of Fantasia at this point. And I quote, "A strip manager's day was ruined when he spotted Fantasia at the front gate. Instead of a greeting, it was always, 'Please, please be careful.' Back to the pits like clockwork they came to thank John for shutting off when he did get out of shape. Bill and Warren went home with a stomachache after every meet. They were so afraid the car was going to crash. How long could this possibly endure? End quote. At this point in time, 1.5 years had been invested into the project, and less than a half dozen runs were even close to full throttle pulls to the finish line. Was it all lost? It might have been, except for one guy, Chuck Finders. Chuck Finders was a brilliant chassis builder and racer of the era, and he approached Henderson and told him to let him install a TorqueFlite automatic transmission and a full rear suspension in the car. Finders was so sure of his ideas and that his work would pay off, he told Henderson that if he failed to lower the car's ET by a full second, he would not ask for any money. Henderson was skeptical, so they started by simply swapping in the TorqueFlite transmission. That did nothing, and the car was still a tire-burning disaster to pilot. Henderson finally capitulated and allowed the rear suspension to be installed. Finders added the suspension, bolted on a set of soft sidewall funny car style slicks of the era, took the car to the drag strip, and made 7 straight runs in the low 9s. Fantasia had been tamed. All of a sudden, the ET started dropping. The car started running in the high 8s at 160 plus. It actually started winning some rounds at fuel-altered shows, and by July of 1967, this 2,300-pound car, which was facing 1,600-pound roadsters, was actually able to hang with them. In fact, on July 23rd of 1967, Lee was the runner-up at an 8-car fuel-altered show at Irwindale and ran a ridiculous for the time, for a full-bodied car, 863 at 170. They had finally found themselves a race car. Early in the 1968 season, the car actually won a 4-car booked-in show at Lyons Drag Strip with a strong showing in qualifying, and during eliminations, reeled off a set of 860s and the car's best-known elapsed time ever at 863 at 172 miles an hour. Finally, Fantasia was what Henderson had always wanted, a winner, and he was doing it his way. So what happened next? Henderson got rid of the car, switched to running a modified roadster, and Fantasia disappeared forever. Perhaps the challenge was gone in Henderson's eyes, or maybe somebody actually offered to buy it and he knew the sooner he said yes, the better his chance was to make some money, or perhaps it was just time to send the seemingly star-crossed, angry, nitro-burning Willys down the road. Either way, the 2.5-year saga of Fantasia, the most insane Willys in the history of drag racing, was over, and with it, the only fuel-altered Willys in history was gone. Ironically, winning was the worst thing that ever happened to the car. That's the story of Fantasia, the man-eating car that never crashed. Long live drag racing's tinkerers, thinkers, and wholly out-of-the-box visionaries, even when they're effectively wrong about everything. Thanks for watching.